Welcome to the Presbyterian Research Center. My name is Collier. In this video I will be discussing the Puritan Thomas Goodwin and how he argues that common grace is an Arminian absurdity. Thomas Goodwin, 1600 to 1680, was an English Puritan. He was part of the Westminster Assembly, which produced the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechisms. He was also a strong Calvinist who wrote over a dozen volumes of theology. In his work titled A Discourse of Election, of the free and special grace of God manifested therein, the absoluteness and unchangeableness of his decrees, and their infallible accomplishment, which was published in London in the year 1682. Thomas Goodwin rejects common grace as an Arminian construct and that it supports the myth of human free will while opposing salvation by grace alone and God's sovereign right to choose those he will have saved. While this is shocking to many nominally Reformed and Presbyterian people today, this is basic Calvinism. Thomas Goodwin writes the following, pay attention, and I quote, "Yet these, the Arminians, would impose upon him a necessity to give forth a common grace, and that he should purpose upon free will terms to save all, or else with them it is not grace to mankind, nor worth the name of it. So zealous are they in pretense for their own nature. Whereas, on the contrary, according to their draught of what is their common grace, when all is summed up, and it comes unto the event, it would not save a man. Corruption in man is so strong, and their assisting grace which they propose is so weak." End quote. The Works of Thomas Goodwin, Volume 9, page 13. The emphasis is mine. Now, Thomas Goodwin points out that the common gracers in his day, as well as in our day, will not accept a definition of grace unless it includes the idea that God purposes to save each human individual who will ever live. You see, for the Arminians, Pelagians, and Papists, if God's grace is not universal, then they will not accept it. Common grace is an unbiblical absurdity which rejects God's particular love for the elect alone, and God's particular purpose to save the elect and reject the reprobates. It also asserts the old Papist notion that God's universal love and redemption is for all men without exception. These Arminian and Papist absurdities are encased in today's common grace doctrine known as the first point of common grace, sometimes simply called the free offer of the gospel or the well-meant offer of the gospel. Now, Thomas Goodwin correctly argues that the reason common grace is pushed so hard by those opposed to basic Calvinism is to protect the myth of human free will from God's absolute predestination of all things. Thomas Goodwin understands that due to the extent of Adam's fall, even if this Papist notion of a common/universal grace were to be admitted, we are speaking hypothetically here, since common grace is nowhere taught in the Bible, it would be no more than a mere assisting grace that could never save a single person, a single sinner, not one single sinner, for all sinners are totally depraved, inclined only to evil, and utterly incapable of doing any good thing whatsoever. In part 1, we saw the Westminster Divine and Calvinist Thomas Goodwin argue against and reject the Arminian myth known as common grace. This Arminian fable is very popular today. This should not surprise anyone, for superstitions, human traditions, and falsities increase in society as biblical knowledge decreases. Countless nominal Presbyterian and Reformed theologians utilize this Arminian fabrication to pretend God loves each individual man without exception, intends in a decretal sense to save every single person, and will save them if they will only use their quote-unquote free will to believe the gospel. Such are the lies of common grace, and these lies reject the doctrines of original sin, total depravity, particular redemption, and intercession, the reasonable nature of God, the divine attribute of God's immutable hatred, sovereign and unconditional double predestination, and so on. The myth of common grace cannot point to a single indicative verse in the Bible to prove its assumption that men have wills that are free from God's absolute predestination. So it does what papists have always done: try and smuggle it past those paying no attention. Puritan Thomas Goodwin, in the following quote, makes fun of this Arminian myth and casts it away. He points out how the human tradition of common grace is utilized to teach that men make themselves into reprobates by not using God's common grace correctly. He writes the following, quote, "There are those in the world that say God hath loved all mankind alike as to salvation, and to that purpose hath in all ages given them helps and divine assistance in common, more or less, which we usually term common grace, which, if their wills being stirred up and moved thereby will use well, then they may and do obtain faith, and an effectual calling unto salvation. And upon the right use of those adjutores, it is that God doth then elect them, and not till then, or upon the foresight from all eternity, that they will do so. But if they do not use those helps well, then they are reprobated or rejected." End quote. The Works of Thomas Goodwin, Volume 9, page 27. The emphasis is mine. Even if one were to accept the common grace fable, it would still fail to aid any unbeliever and would show God to be a finite failure unable to accomplish his eternal desires. Think about that. In the subsequent quote, Thomas Goodwin contrasts Noah and the unconverted reprobates. The unconverted reprobate world which surrounded him when he was alive, prior to the flood. Thomas Goodwin taunts those who hold to this fabrication they call common grace. He writes, and I quote, "But you will say, was there none of the elect among them? Yes, Noah was, and some of his family. Well, but still, what put the difference of Noah from the rest of the whole world? Look into the same chapter, Genesis 6, and the 8th verse. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Pray, what do you think to be the meaning of finding grace in the eyes of the Lord? It expresseth election in the words of my text, as also when God says of Moses, "The chosen of God, I have known thee by name, and thou hast found grace in my sight," and is all one with the apostles, "By grace ye are saved," Ephesians 2. And so he became heir of the righteousness of faith, Hebrews 9, verse 7. For faith follows election inseparably. So then the election obtained it, and the rest, with all their free will helps, yet being left to flesh, were blinded and hardened. This is a strange thing, that among a whole world of people there should not be found one whose free will, assisted by common and general grace, should have obtained it. For he styles them the world of ungodly. What? Not one? And that Noah by election grace should obtain it. Who would not venture to be saved by the way of election grace when it is a word to one that a man is saved no other way? End quote. That was on page 30 that time, the emphasis mine. So notice how Thomas Goodwin points out the obvious biblical truth. Grace cannot be separated from election and salvation. There is no such thing as God's grace failing to save one he desires to save. God's grace is common among the elect and no one else. Thanks for watching, and God bless.